Actually, the first time he meets Brown, he's out in Kansas running guns for the New England Immigrant Societies. First, he's raising money. And then so you got to bring us the gun. So he's out there, and he's just riding around. And of course, at this point, he's got this giant sombrero on, and he's got his Sharps rifle, and he's got his Bowie knife stuck in his boot. And he rides into a pro-slavery town in Kansas territory. And he's talking to these two ruffians, and they said, "Well, there's this radical minister out here, and he's ministering to the Negroes." And doesn't use the word Negro. And we're going to find him, and we're going to kill him. And Higginson says, "Well, I'll keep my eyes peeled, and if I see anybody who looks like that, I'll let you know." And of course, what they're looking for is kind of the classic stereotype New England minister. And here's the 6'2" guy with a rifle and a Bowie knife. But again, he was never afraid of that kind of danger.
This program is a video presentation of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Please consider making a monetary gift to support our efforts to bring Civil War history to viewers like you. Visit CWRTDC.org to learn how.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Civil War Roundtable District of Columbia Zoom meeting on January 7th, 2025. Glad to see we have about 56 folks attending via Zoom, so that is great. We have a very full and very interesting program ahead of us tonight. I am delighted that our Roundtable's director, Fergus Bordewick, was able to get Dr. Doug Egerton to speak to us about his latest book, Man on Fire, The Worlds of Thomas Wentworth Higginson. The book was officially launched today, and his talk, I'm happy to say, is Dr. Egerton's premier presentation on it. If everyone could take a look at our website and see what we have written about Doug. He's an amazing author and professor at Le Moyne in Syracuse, and he studied at Georgetown University. And we talked yesterday about, we knew the same professor at Georgetown, Dr. Foley, a wonderful teacher. And I'm sure that, as you'll see tonight, we stand on the shoulders of other folks that teach us a lot. And Dr. Foley taught a lot to his students, including me. Dr. Egerton is another person where people will be standing on his shoulders in the study of Civil War history. Thank you very much. Welcome, Doug, and go ahead with your presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, good to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, the book is out as of today. And I told Kurt I'd talk maybe 30, 40 minutes, and then we can go to questions and discussion. And for those who are not really that conversant on who Higginson is, I've got about 10 or 11 images that Kurt can sort of bring up. So let me start, though, with the first question I always get when I'm doing a book talk, which is, why did you write this book? What made you want to write this book? And what made you want to write it now? And I find in my case, this is my 9th solo book. I'm not young, as you can see. And I find that in my case, one book leads to the next. That's probably true for most historians. You come across something in a book, just gets a few pages, maybe a chapter, a few cameos, and you think, well, this itself is worthy of a book. And Higginson actually had cameos in my last 2 books, going back 2 books. That was on the pioneering Northern New England regiments, the 54th, 55th, 5th Cavalry. And when young Robert Gould Shaw in the 54th got down to the Carolina coast, Higginson was already there. He'd been there about 2 months with his regiment of contraband troops, runaways from South Carolina and Florida. The two had never met before. They met then in Beaufort, shortly before Shaw's death at the Battle of Fort Wagner. But they had a lot in common. Both were New England men, both were Harvard men. Virtually everybody in Higginson's family was a Harvard man, going back generations. Shaw, of course, was not an abolitionist, but his parents were. And he, of course, was a good Lincoln Republican. And Higginson, unlike a lot of abolitionists, kind of held his nose and voted for Lincoln in 60. And so they came from kind of old money New England background. So they sort of really hit it off. And then, of course, Shaw died. So we had a few cameos there. And then that book led to my next book called Heirs of an Honored Name. And that is about the 3rd and 4th generation of Adamses, Charles Francis Sr., Charles Francis Jr., and the various kids. And of course, Charles Francis Jr., the grandson of John Quincy, led a black regiment during the Civil War. He was the colonel, finally, of the 5th Cavalry, Massachusetts Cavalry. And so they had that in common. And they knew each other before and during the war. And Higginson, as a young man, had been down in the Free Soil trenches in the 1840s with Charles Francis Sr., who, of course, at the time was a rising politician. And, of course, as you all know, became Lincoln's ambassador to Britain. And Higginson and Charles Francis Jr. always hit it off, which is interesting because Higginson apparently didn't really know well what Adams thought of the black men under his command. Higginson really came to understand and appreciate the black guys he led during the Civil War, and Adams never did. Adams didn't want to get to know the guys under his command. Oddly, he never seemed to know that one of his corporals was Lewis Douglas, the son of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who, of course, had been an ally with Charles Francis Sr., in the abolition days. Charles Francis Jr. doggedly in correspondence home used the N-word. That was the only word he had for his black soldiers. But the two were lifelong friends, and both in the 1880s became Democrats. They quit being Republicans. They were unhappy with the corruption that was taking place in the party under people like James G. Blaine. Higginson was also a free trader, a low tariff man, as was Adams. Higginson was always on the side of the poor, and of course the working class, and especially American farmers, were low tariff guys. They didn't care where their plow came from. They wanted the cheapest plow possible, and so they had that in common. And when Higginson died in 1911, Charles Francis Jr. and Andrew Carnegie were pallbearers in his funeral. So why write this book? Well, I really sort of identified with Higginson as an older guy, a white guy. I'll not hide my politics. I'm a progressive. He obviously was a very progressive guy. And he was the ally. And I was called the book The Ally because if there was a cause he was in. He was a women's rights man. He was an abolitionist, and not just anti-slavery. He was for civil rights, although he, of course, was raised Protestant and was a Protestant minister for a time. He was very much opposed to Massachusetts laws that were against Catholics using a Catholic Bible in schools, and so he was very progressive in all those ways. And so I kind of really identified with that. And he was raised by very strong-minded, determined women, and that's my story back there in Arizona. And he had daughters, and I've got daughters and now granddaughters. And so my wife, his historian, Lee Fott, who I think is going to be speaking to your group later in the spring, said, now's the time to do this book, and you're the guy to write it. And finally, I always like to kind of write things that haven't been done before. Most of my books are really kind of uncharted territories, and there actually were 3 older biographies of Higginson, and weirdly all published kind of back to back in 1967 and 68, and I didn't really like any of them. One written by an attorney, not to pick on attorneys, my sister's a judge, but it had no scholarly apparatus of any kind, no footnotes, that kind of thing, and really focused on his career as a colonel during the Civil War. And for Higginson, that was an important part of his life, and he always liked to be called colonel after the war. But that was not the only part of his life. And the second book that came out that year really focused on his connection with poet Emily Dickinson, which is obviously an important part of his career as well. But again, a small part. They only met twice. They corresponded quite a bit, but only met twice. And the last book, which was the most scholarly, was written at a time. This was written by people who'd been in World War II. My dad was in World War II. They'd seen war up front. It was not an abstraction, and they were very critical of the 1850s and the men who didn't avoid war. And so in the 1950s and 60s, it was commonplace among historians to say, well, there's sure blame to go around here. The abolitionists were kind of just a little too determined to get rid of slavery, a little too hard-headed, as were, of course, Southern fire eaters, the real radicals, people like John C. Calhoun. And Higginson never bought that equivalency. And I don't buy that either. Full confession here, my family were North Carolina slaveholders and Confederates. My cousin, who lives in D.C., by the way, has the family Bible that has the name of the slaves in it. And Higginson did not believe that the enslavement of 4 million Black Americans made him unusually difficult or hard-headed. So, I didn't like any of those approaches. And what I really tried to emphasize in my book, and Kurt and I were talking about this yesterday, this is also where the subtitle comes from. Higginson kept this great diary. And by the way, for those who are interested, he gave all his papers to his Harvard, and a lot of them have been digitized. And so you can actually go online, Thomas Wentworth Higginson papers, Harvard, Houghton Library. And in 1881, after the war, he said, I'll probably never have a biographer. He said, but if I do, here's the clue to my life. I never wanted to focus on a single issue. I wanted to be, he said, I want to be a whole man. I want to be involved in every possible issue there is out there. So that actually was my editor's idea, The Worlds of Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Because, yes, he was an abolitionist, but he was also a women's rights man. He was also a temperance guy. He was a poet, not a very good one. He was a writer. He was a man of many parts, a real kind of Renaissance man. And he just didn't want to prioritize. I think in many ways, that's why he's not as well known today as the people he knew. So, yeah, I mean, he never tried to prioritize. And he was the kind of guy, he would speak at a Boston anti-slavery rally, and next day get on the train to go to Cleveland or go to Philadelphia for a women's rights conference, and then head back to New Hampshire for a temperance conference. He was a very big man. He was 6'2", especially big for those days, and believed devoutly in exercise. And wherever he was, he's on the Carolina coast, he builds a gymnasium for himself. So he was always a real advocate, including for women, of physical health and wearing bloomers and not wearing corsets and So he was just kind of all in on every possible way. And he also made his living with his pen. A lot, mostly the Atlantic Monthly, and they paid him pretty well. Short stories during the war, of course, he was writing about what he was seeing down there in South Carolina. Wrote a lot of poems. I'm not much of a critic, but my colleagues who are, and he knew he was not Emerson. I mean, he knew real poets like Emerson. But he did pretty well with his pen. That also kind of made him unusual for most of his cohort, although Douglass, of course, published 3 versions of his autobiography and did pretty well with those. So can we go to the next image? Here's where he was born, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, about 2 blocks from Harvard, and the house is still there. It's privately owned. So he was born in 1823, and the Higginsons went back to the 1620s. They arrived in Plymouth Colony and Boston Bay Colony. Been ministers, again, all gone to Harvard. And here's his mother, and that is Louisa Storrow. There is no image of his father. And his father was much, much older than he was, and he was the last of many children. And his father died when he was 9, and his father was just kind of a non-presence in his life, as far as I can tell. He mentions him once in his autobiography. He says, yeah, my dad, Stephen, he died when I was 9. His grandfather, who Higginson did talk about in his memoirs, ran a mercantile firm in Boston and had been a revolutionary, been part of the state convention, writing the new state constitution. But the company had gone bankrupt during the War of 1812, thanks to Jefferson's, embargoes and tariffs on Britain. So his father took a job as a steward at Harvard College, where, of course, he'd gone to school. It was his job to buy books for the library and collect payments from students. And he was very bad at it. He was not a careful man with a dollar, and finally was fired by the trustees for just bad sort of bookkeeping. So instead, it really was Louisa and her sister, who never married, Aunt Nancy, who raised Higginson. I think this is really important. Louisa was wife number 2. In fact, she'd been hired to take care of wife number 1, who was chronically unwell, in part because she had just so many children. So Louisa was 21 years younger than Stephen Higginson, and was still pretty young when Stephen died. And so Aunt Nancy moved in, and the 2 of them raised, she called him Tommy. And he was the last of her 9 children. She had 9 children. She buried 4. And 2 of those she buried were right above, in the family lineage, right above Higginson. So he basically was raised as an only child. So he has these much, much, much older step siblings he just kind of was never really in contact with. He has one full brother, Waldo, corresponded with, but he's basically raised as an only child. And Louisa kept a diary. And, all parents think their children are wonderful. Louisa was positive that little Tommy was the smartest, best child on the planet. And her diary is nothing but, even when her husband's alive, she just doesn't mention it. Her diary is nothing but, Tommy's so brilliant. And I gave him a new book, and he read it in 10 minutes, and he lined his little soldiers up on the floor. And Aunt Nancy had the same kind of attitude. So I think in many ways, this explains Higginson's feminism. Because again, he's raised by a very, very smart, really strong-willed mother. And when he does get out of line later in life, she lets him know. And I think it's also the source of his enormous self-confidence. He's raised by people who think he walks on water. And because he basically is kind of an only child at that point in his early life, he gets 100% of her attention. No matter where he is, he almost always went to her every day. He's out there in Kansas running guns to free soil, settlers. He's writing back to Louisa, even more than his wife, Mary. he's on the Carolina coast. He's writing to her, and she finally died of old age during the Civil War, 1864, and he mourned her for years. So they were very, very close. And please, next slide. So here he is in 1846. He finished Harvard, and then he'd gone back to the divinity school to get additional training. He decided to train for the ministry. He thought briefly about the law, and he decided just didn't want to do the law. So here he is at the age of 23. And, for those who are my age, and a lot of you seem to be my age, this seems to be kind of pretty hip hairdo, like looks sort of like me in the 1970s. But actually, it was called the side part. It was a hairstyle worn by young professionals, attorneys, and not by the sort of Brahmins that was his background. So he decided clearly that he was going to be, kind of a straight arrow sort of guy. But at this point in his life, he was already courting the slightly older Mary Chandler, who was a distant. She was like second cousin, once removed, that kind of thing. Her father taught medicine at Harvard. So by this point in 46, he has to decide what he's going to do in life. He wants to get married. That means he needs a job. And so he accepted, and here's the church. It was more than a century old when he got the job. It's the first Unitarian church, Newburyport, Massachusetts. And so it was his first job, and he and Mary. And in some ways, people didn't really get his marriage to Mary Chandler. Again, he's big, he's athletic, he's positive, he's charismatic. He was emulating the world's happiest guy. And she was chronically unwell. And maybe because of that, she was a pretty caustic figure. And a lot of his friends wrote letters saying, I had dinner with Worth and Mary, and man, she's got a sharp tongue. That was a word they would use. And Mary, I think because she was not well, and Higginson was, tall, good-looking guy, and I found letters from women saying, I look at him in the pulpit and I think he's a really good-looking guy. She was very jealous of the women he was close to, especially two I'll talk about later on. One was Emily Dickinson, and the other was Lucy Stone. So he gets a job as the minister, and is almost promptly fired. He lasts for 2 years. He refused to tone his sermons down. They wanted some kind of traditional Calvinist, Unitarian discourse. And he wanted to talk about the sin of slavery and why women in the Bible had equal rights, that kind of thing. And to be fair to the trustees, he was gone a lot. Again, if he got a call to come to an abolitionist convention in New York, he was on the train and would have someone fill in for him. And he was getting a pretty decent salary. The final straw came in 1848, and for Thanksgiving, and they expected the usual Thanksgiving homily, what a great country, et cetera, et cetera. And he gave a sermon called Merchants, and it was published as a pamphlet, and abolitionists in Ireland were reading it. And he really went after the wealthy guys in his congregation, especially those who had cotton textile factories or interests in cotton textile factories and were doing business with Southern slaveholders. And so the trustees simply announced that he was out. And I found a lot of correspondence from young women saying, oh, no, we don't want him fired. We really like him, but he was out. So for several years, he made his living with his pen and also on the Lyceum circuit. And Bob, I'm sure you all know what the Lyceum circuit was, but in those days, there wasn't television, there wasn't movies. And so one of the things you do a couple times a week is you go to the public building or the church, or sometimes if it's nice outdoors, some kind of big tent, and listen to traveling speakers. And like a lot of these people, he had an agent, and he got paid in expenses to travel and give sermons and lectures, that kind of thing. He had the same agent as Frederick Douglass, and so they actually were making money, on this circuit, and writing pieces for the Atlantic. And then finally was offered a job at a church in Worcester, Massachusetts. And he went and visited Worcester. And of course, it was a real hotbed of anti-slavery. And he decided, this is the place. And they loved him and never tried to tone down his sermons. And of course, while he's there, 1850, Congress passes the infamous Fugitive Slave Act. And again, I'm sure you know all about this, a dramatic revision of the old 1793 Federal Slave Act. And of course, the difference is it used federal marshals instead of local law officials to round up runaway slaves. It offered accused runaways no court, no attorneys. A runaway slave had not broken the law. It was the person who was helping them who had broken the law. To put it bluntly and crudely, a runaway slave was like a cow who'd wandered off the pasture. And also, federal marshals could say, you and you and you and you, there's a runaway slave in town, and I'm deputizing you. There's no debate about this. And you're going to come and help me arrest this guy. So it really forced people who had not thought much about slavery basically into being complicit with slavery. And so in 1854, I'm in a really celebrated case, and there's a lot of books about this. A Virginia runaway named Anthony Burns made it to Boston, and it's just one of those kind of weird small world things, walking down the street, and was seen by a friend of the guy who owned him in Virginia. So he's arrested by federal marshals and clapped into the courthouse. And so Higginson's out in Worcester and gets a telegram saying, got to come into Boston now. He gets on the train, comes in. And as the indication on the right is the big meeting at Faneuil Hall, Garrison's there, and there's speeches going on. What can we do about this? And, what a sinful thing this is to do. And Higginson had no patience for that kind of thing. And here's one real difference between guys like Garrison and Higginson, and also guys like Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Again, I'm sure you know this, but Garrison was a pacifist. He believed in what he called moral suasion. And his view was that slavery was so self-evidently wrong and immoral. You simply can convince slaveholders in 1 or 2 decades max that slavery is evil, and they'll go, oh, okay, we get it. Walk away from that. Higginson, again, was a very physical guy. Oh, he was fired from one of his first jobs teaching boys for teaching them how to box. He thought they should not only read, they should box. And so he was fired from a public school right after he got out of Harvard. So Higginson believed in what he called physical force abolitionist, in which you use any means necessary, a pen, words, or your fists, or a gun to get rid of slavery. And that, of course, was the view of most Black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. So Higginson's hearing these speeches and just kind of runs out of patience. And he walks out of the Faneuil Hall, and there's a Black activist there, former slave, named Lewis Hayden. And Higginson says to Hayden, let's go, let's do this. So I love this. So here on the left, Higginson bought a dozen axes, and if they have to, they're going to just chop down the door of the courthouse and try to free Anthony Burns. They have no idea he's been held literally in chains upstairs, heavily guarded, but they figure we just break in the door and get him out. Unlike his dad, Higginson was a careful man with a penny. So every time he buys something, it's very detailed. He keeps this in his papers. So he buys these axes to break in the door. And so as they're collecting these axes, they pass a building site, this is Boston, pass a building site, and there's this giant beam that's going to be used for a ceiling beam. So Higginson and Hayden, and about 8 other guys, most of them Black, just pick it up like it's the Middle Ages and just go running down toward the courthouse door like they're going to bash it in. And please, next image. This is called The Attack on the Courthouse. This is an 1856 book about the Anthony Burns affair. The person who wrote it and apparently drew the images was not part of the mob, but he was there watching. So this is kind of a bird's eye view. So here's all these guys. You can see them holding this kind of giant beam. They just go running at the door like, again, it's like the 14th century. It's a castle. Smashing the door. And Hayden probably pulls out a gun and shoots one of the guards and kills him. And Higginson's unarmed, but he's got his fists, as he puts it. So he's trying to box his way into the jail. And one of the guards pulls out a sword and slashes his chin, just cuts it way open. And if you look at the cover of the book, I'm not suggesting you go back now. Higginson was very proud of the scar, and he wore what was called cavalry whiskers, which is the mustache that goes into the sideburns, and so the chin is unshaven. So you see the scar. He was very proud of the scar. But the bad news is, again, there's just no way to get Burns out. He was too well guarded. He was literally chained to a bed, on the upstairs floors. So it failed. Higginson went back to Worcester. And the president was Franklin Pierce. And Pierce, of course, was just determined the fugitive slave law was going to be enforced. He was trying, of course, he was a New England man. He was trying to show the South that, Yankees would behave. And so Pierce made it very clear that these guys should all be arrested. And this actually becomes almost kind of funny, although probably not for the marshal. So a deputy marshal, unfortunately named Asa Buttman, gets on the train and goes to Worcester to arrest Higginson. By the time he arrives there, this mob knows he's getting off the train. These are mostly Black men, probably the sons of slaves or some of them, probably runaways. So this mob descends on Buttman, wants him in the head with a brick, knocks him down. And so, of course, who saves Buttman? Higginson comes walking out, parting the mob like he's parting the waters, stops the riot, puts Buttman in his carriage, drives him to the train station, buys him a ticket for Boston, and says, don't come back. And Buttman says, no, I promise I'm really not going to. Higginson said in his diary, I'd never seen anybody that scared in my life. So that was Higginson. And please, next slide. So then, of course, comes 1861, and the war breaks out. At this point, Higginson's 38 years old, and while he's still, very big, very robust, he figures at his age he's not going to see any kind of active duty. And like a lot of abolitionists, he's unhappy that Lincoln is not moving fast enough on eradicating slavery. And of course, we all know now why that was, why Lincoln had to keep Maryland happy and Kentucky happy. But for hardcore guys like Douglas and Higginson, it wasn't moving fast enough. So he finally accepts a job as a captain, a desk captain, for the 51st Massachusetts Infantry. He figures he'll spend the war doing paperwork, but just in case, he starts reading books on tactics and battles, that kind of thing. And in late 62, in October, he gets a letter from Rufus Saxton. And Saxton was already down on the coast. And you probably all know early on, the U.S. Navy and Army in a combined attack captured Beaufort. And so they were using Beaufort as kind of their base on the Carolina coast. And Saxton was a West Point guy. Saxton was career military, but also very much anti-slavery, which a lot of generals, as I'm sure you know, were not. And a regiment had already been formed. Runaways from North Florida, runaways from the Carolina coast. Also, when U.S. Army captured Beaufort, whites just fled inland, and so the Army arrives and no one's there except for slaves who kind of freed themselves by just staying, in Beaufort. But had been very troubled. The leadership had been really bad at running the regiment, and Saxton, who Higginson didn't know, wrote and said, "You've got to come down here and take command of this regiment and clean it up and make it work." So he wasn't sure. So Higginson went down, and again, he's a man of privilege. He's a Harvard guy, and these are people who are like days out of slavery, and a lot of them have parents who were Africans who were brought into Charleston Harbor before they'd been cut off January 1, 1808. So these are people just unlike Higginson as possible. And here's an actual image of South Carolina First. They're all lined up. They camped out on a plantation seized by the U.S. military just outside of Beaufort. And Higginson just kind of chatted with the guys. And one guy had been injured on an upriver raid. And Higginson said, "So probably more than you signed up for." And the soldier said, "Master, this is exactly what I signed up for." And Higginson made a mental note, "Tell the soldiers not to call me master." And that night, he then heard them singing and praying, kind of a classic ring shout. Probably a lot of you have seen the film Glory. And if you have, this is scene before the night of battle, when they're singing and praying, and the young stuttering soldier gets up and says, "If I die tomorrow on land, on water, Bible in one hand, the rifle in the other." That actually is what Higginson heard a soldier saying. It's actually from his diary in his book on the war. And found Saxton, said, "I accept." And so went back to the coast. Bernie Siller saying that he was in glory. Well, we can talk about that in a few minutes. I watch it every July 18. I wish it was a bit more accurate, but I love it. And of course, it's incredibly well acted and moving. So he served with the regiment, and he understood he had to just treat these guys with the lightest touch possible. He wrote to his mother and he said, "There's nothing we can do to these guys in the way of punishment that hasn't already been done to them." These guys arrived with cuts on their back from the whip. And they arrive with their wives, their children. They bring their aged parents with them. Higginson said, "If I say you can't bring your wife into camp, they're just going to leave." Plus, of course, as a former minister, Higginson loved officiating at weddings. And so but every third day he was marrying one of his soldiers to a woman he brought with her. So very, very light touch, relying on his non-commissioned black sergeants and corporals, basically to run it while he led the occasional upriver raid in search of lumber or freeing of the slaves or, iron, that kind of thing. Next image, please. And this is one of my favorite stories in the book. So it's January 1, 1863. It's Emancipation Day. It's the day that the Emancipation Proclamation, as you all know, is going to become finalized by Lincoln. And again, these guys were already in the military. They were under military protection. But, what if the U.S. lost the war to the Confederacy? What would happen to them? And they're aware of that. This is the first day they're going to become officially free. So they have this big ceremony in Beaufort. They build a stage. And you see Higginson sitting kind of center left, sitting down with the beard. So one time he didn't have cavalry whiskers. I guess he couldn't shave that well down there. So these are his black sergeant and corporal, Prince Rivers and Robert Sutton, standing up as the color guard. So there's all these white ministers there, and there's white teachers who've come to Beaufort to work with the American Missionary Association, and all these wives and children of the soldiers. This huge celebration, and somebody's droning on the stage, and Higginson hasn't spoken yet. And a black man down front starts singing "My Country, 'Tis of Thee." And the white teachers on the stand begin to join in. And Higginson turns around and shuts them. He says, no, leave it to them. And he said, in a letter home, he said they'd never had a country before. And now finally they have, and these guys are willing to fight and die for a country that in many cases doesn't want them. bear in mind at this point, Dred Scott is still the law of the land, and Tawny is still alive, barely, was still alive. But I just love that line, leave it to them. They've never had a country, and now they're willing to fight for it. Higginson said in his diary, I got up and said a few banal things, but nothing that I could say matched the meaning of that simple song. It's just an incredible image. So this is from the Atlantic Monthly, and it's just kind of a great story. Next image, please. For a raid, and the army needs just any modern army just needs a ton of material. They need wood, they need lumber, they need lead, iron, and again, he wants to free slaves. He's working also with Harry Tubman down there, sailing up these rivers. And the gunboat they're on is called the John Adams, is attacked by Confederates on either side of the river. And Higginson almost died, 64. An exploded shell blows by him and misses his side by like probably a fraction of an inch. He looks down and there's no blood. It knocks him to the ground. He said it was like getting hit by like a master boxer. It knocks him to the ground, puts his hand here and no blood, but the shell cracked every rib on his right side and he could barely breathe. So they sent him back home to mend, and he did. He came back to the coast, but he just couldn't do it anymore. It took him several years to actually learn how to breathe. He just had a really hard time because, the crack, the pain to the ribs. So this is an image of 65 when he's home, and I think it tells us a lot about what these guys endured in the war. Here he is kind of looking off into sort of the middle distance. He's gone back to the cavalry whiskers, but he has this kind of almost sort of haunted look in his face. He'd just seen too much. And this raid he was in where he almost dies, the soldier next to it, his head is literally blown off. I mean, it's just, it's really kind of bloody debacle. And he needed quiet. And he would get invitations, can you come speak and talk about your war experience, or come to this civil rights convention or women's rights convention? And he'd write back, he'd say, he would go for long walks. We love walking. Long walks in the woods, walk in the quiet of the snow. He just kind of really needed silence. And it took him a couple of years to sort of get back to where he'd been before. And I think this photograph really sort of captures this kind of, not sad as much as just kind of haunted expression. And, we can probably guess that every third guy, 65 on both sides of the Mason-Dixon, who'd survived the war had this kind of expression. Next, please. So again, he was a women's rights man, and the two women he was most associated with, aside from his wife and his mother, and here she is, the poet on the left, Emily Dickinson. So as I said before, he wrote poetry, and he knew people like Walt Whitman, who, by the way, he didn't like, Emerson, who he did like, and he was aware of the fact that he wasn't going to be remembered for his poetry, 200 years. And he wrote a piece for the Atlantic called Advice to Young Readers. And he said, don't be stymied by the fact that you think you're not great. He said, just, get your stuff out there, interact with the public, get some feedback. So 61, when he's still in Massachusetts as a desk captain, he gets an unsigned letter. It's from Amherst, Massachusetts. It's got 3 poems in it, written in pencil, and a calling card with Emily Dickinson's name on it, and a 1-sentence letter saying, will you tell me if my prose is alive? And Higginson didn't really get her poetry. And I've got a colleague in English who wrote actually a book about Emily Dickinson. He said, I'm not sure I get her poetry either. I mean, it's very different kind of stuff. And of course, when Higginson's poetry was kind of the classic sort of poetry we learned how to do in 8th grade, whereas Dickinson, if you've read her work, is very free form, and Higginson would always add punctuation when he'd send it back, like you need a comma here, that kind of thing. But he understood that it was brilliant and it was new, and if he didn't understand it, he grasped that it was really something extraordinary. They corresponded for years. They only met twice. He was actually giving a talk in Amherst, and if you know the story, she doesn't leave her house. She's a real private, kind of almost sort of a recluse. So he actually is giving a talk in Amherst, and he writes a little note and says, hi, can I stop by? And she writes back and says, well, yeah, I guess if you have to. So he shows up, she comes tripping down the stairway holding flowers. Actually, they talk and have dinner for like 8 hours, have a great time. But I just found her so odd. And again, gulf, I'm sure, between the brilliant poet and the rather odd person. When Higginson, as an abolitionist, joined the military, it made the news. And by the way, people like from Kentucky, Maryland, states that had not left the Union, but were, slave states, they didn't like him. And the Kentucky U.S. senator gave this to him in the Senate, and he said, this is the guy who killed guarded the Anthony Burns. It wasn't Higginson, but he was there. And now he's being honored by being a captain, now a colonel. Apparently, the one person in the country who didn't know where Higginson was Emily Dickinson. So she'd write him send him these poems, and he's on the Carolina coast leading raids, and of course he doesn't respond. She'd write him and say, well, what if I did to upset you? If I made you mad somehow? Finally, apparently someone said to her, oh, by the way, he's leading black soldiers to South Carolina. And she wrote him and she said, well, who will tell me if you die? Which had to be the last kind of letter that anybody wants to get, when they're on the front. And she really tried Mary's patience, because it's Mary, the wife back home, who's collecting the letters. And at one point says to Higginson, why do the insane cling to you? And she met Emily Dickinson. I suspect in many ways she was kind of envious of Dickinson, who again Higginson thought was just the smartest person he'd ever met in his life. And you probably know Dickinson was never terribly well, and she knew she was going to die. She was younger than Higginson. And so very carefully mapped out, she wanted a very small funeral, but she said, he will be there. You will tell him he's got to come. And here's the poem by Emily Bronte that he will read in my behalf. And he writes about going to the open casket and how she looks so young and beautiful. So that this connection. And then he co-edited the first 3 volumes of her poetry after she died. And at one point, his kind of standard editor said, we're not going to publish this stuff. No one's going to read it. And Higginson said, if you don't publish this, I will never send you another essay. And of course, today it's her stuff that is studied in college and not Higginson's one novel or bad poems. So they really were connected. Here on the right is one of his favorite humans. This is Lucy Stone. Lucy Stone was an abolitionist and she was a feminist. In 1854, she's going to marry. She's 37. She's much older than most women at the time who get married. And another fellow abolitionist named Richard Blackwell, who, by the way, Higginson didn't have much faith in, and it turns out good thing. He actually cheated on Lucy. But she wanted to get married, and she wanted to control her own finances, and she wanted to keep her surname. She was not going to become Elizabeth Blackwell, Lucy Blackwell. She was going to be Lucy Stone. She refused to say the word obey in the marriage vow. And she could not find a minister in Boston who would agree to those terms. And she recalled meeting Higginson at a women's rights conference a couple of years before, in the early 50s, and sent him a telegram. And his response, as always, was, I'm on the train. There I am. So he came down and brought Mary. And they had a lovely time, although Lucy did not warm up to Mary. And rather probably uncharitably, Lucy believed that Mary's health issues were part of just in her mind, and that the more famous Higginson became, the more kind of unwell Mary became. It's probably not fair, but again, most people just didn't like Mary. So he officiated at the wedding, and the two of them wrote a statement explaining why she would not take her husband's name and why she would not say obey. It was widely published and, of course, lauded by feminists and condemned by anti-feminists. After the war, they remained allies. They co-edited the Women's Journal until late in life. And so again, no, if there was a cause, he was there. And the last slide, please. So Mary died in 1887. And again, she'd never been well. And Higginson was, appropriately sad about that. Had a very small private funeral. 2 years later, like with Higginson, probably like with Dickinson, got a letter from a woman named Mary Thatcher, who was a writer, pretty well traveled too, and said, what do you think of this chapter? What do you think of this work? And they began to court. And so 2 years after the first Mary died, he and Mary Thatcher married. He always called the second Mary Minnie, I suppose, probably just kind of, keep it straight in his mind, who was Mary, who was Minnie. What's interesting is she was 21 years younger than Higginson, in the same way that Louisa was 21 years younger than Higginson's father. And of course, he never had any children with Mary because, again, she was so unwell. So he had 2 daughters, and tragically one died a year old of spinal meningitis. But here is Margaret, and Margaret went on to have children. So he actually had, in his life, grandchildren. And I love this picture. So this is a very, very complicated kind of bicycle. And Higginson bought it in part because it was really hard to ride and to guide. And again, he's a physical guy. He's 63 here in this picture. So he's a late in life father. And little Margaret's 2 years old. And so he wants to have the bike that's really going to kind of push him, and keep him sort of really healthy. And so when he gets this tricked out seat so Margaret can ride with him, it made the news all the way across the country. It was just sort of kind of fun, beloved thing to do. So even in Southern papers, they never kind of really forgave him for the war. They're actually writing editorials saying this is really cute. He's like riding around his bike with Margaret. And here he is in the last year of his life, sort of the grand old man. Died in 1911 and pretty vigorous until the last few months, and was giving a public talk and wasn't going well. And then, most embarrassing, he had a hard time walking off the stage. And Margaret, who at the time was a young woman, was there and said, Dad, maybe it's time. You give up the public life. And in fact, he had to kind of stumble off the stage. He never used the cane, that kind of thing. Yeah, it was really sort of bothered him. So here he is, again, the last year of his life, grand old man, still engaged in all kinds of public activities. Frenemies with Susan B. Anthony. They were friends, they were enemies, they were friends, they were enemies, which is pretty much the case of anybody with Susan B. Anthony. And so again, when he died, small funeral. Charles Francis Adams, again, was one of the pallbearers. Andrew Carnegie was one of the pallbearers. And so just kind of a really sort of full life. And let me kind of conclude this way, then we go to sort of Q&A. I mean, I could go on for hours. Most historians can drone on pretty well. There's so many parts of his life that I just found fascinating. You probably all know he was one of John Brown's Secret Six, and was basically because, again, of his good bookkeeping skills, was the one in charge of keeping the monies from people like Garrett Smith, who would give money to Brown, and Brown would pass it on to Higginson to kind of watch over. He was involved in a plot to get John Brown's guys broken out of jail in Western Virginia, which of course kind of went nowhere. These are so many parts of his life that were fascinating and weird little cameos that I just loved. And again, he had this wonderful diaries, especially after Mary died, spent some time abroad, England. And so there he is having dinner with Charles Dickens. There he is having dinner with Darwin, H.G. Wells, the sci-fi writer and socialist. Young Winston Churchill, who of course had been in the Boer War, captured by the Boers, escaped, wrote a book about it, was touring New England and New York, signing book copies. And so there's one diary entry. He had dinner with young Mr. Churchill. Seems like a fine young soldier. My favorite one, he's riding bikes. And he said, rode bikes today with Miss Sullivan and her ward, Miss Keller. That's Andy Sullivan and Helen Keller. He's riding bikes. One assumes that Andy Sullivan was a two-seater bike and Andy Sullivan was the one steering. But there's just kind of odd little sort of cameos that it's just, I had dinner tonight with Mr. Darwin. We talked about Mark Twain. And he knew Mark Twain. They had summer houses next to each other and would have dinner together and tell jokes and say kind of odd things about their wives back and forth to each other only. So he was sort of everywhere. And I just found that so much fun to write about. Let me finish this way, then we can go to discussions and Q&A. I see there's a question about he and John Brown. The title, A Man in Full, A Man on Fire, comes from his obituary. Like I said, I wanted to call it the Ally. My editor said, what about this? This is great. And it's when he died, the editor said he was a man on fire, meaning he was just, involved in every possible thing. And I think that's why I think his story is a story for our time. Well, we're so disillusioned in many ways, and the world seems to be coming apart, and the Middle East is on fire, and Americans are divided as they've not been, probably since I was a boy watching, the Vietnam War on television. I found out last fall, most of my students don't vote, and a good number of them are not even registered to vote, which I find just kind of appalling. And Higginson's long life reminds us there's always cause for optimism. There's always a new cause to be taken up. There's always a new book to be written. If you're looking for probably a lot of you already read this, but his 1870 book called Army Life in a Black Regiment, about his time on the Carolina coast, it's still in print, in paperback and in hardback, 155 years later. And what author and what historian doesn't want to see their book stay in print for 20 years, let alone for a century and a half? So his is just an optimistic life, a man on fire, a whole man, and a great story.
Thank you very much, Doug. If I hadn't muted everybody, you'd hear a lot of clapping. If folks can go ahead and turn their video back on and open their mics if they have any questions, that would be great. I don't know if people can see this. This is the book. It is available now, and it's on Amazon. And just the introduction is worth the price of the book, but there's just so much more. I haven't finished reading it, but there's so much I'm learning. And he was, I was mentioning this to Doug that I like to be I consider myself a jack of all trades and master of none, whereas Higginson was a jack of all trades and a master of those. His poetry wasn't that bad, but it wasn't, of course, up to par with some of the folks
That's
he
not
dealt with.
my area of alleged expertise, but yeah, my colleague, a guy named Pat Keene, who had a great book about Willie Dickinson. I showed him some of Higginson's poetry, and he said, "Well, it's not really Dickinson, is it?" And I think, there's a reason why today we read Dickinson and Emerson. But again, Army Life of the Black Regiment still in print, and I have a nice hardback edition. You can find it on Amazon for like $25, and that's a claim to fame.
One other thing I'll say before we get into the questions is now that I've seen the pictures a little bit more closely, I know we have some reenactors. I'm not a reenactor myself, but I think if you just changed your beard there a little bit, I think you would be a great reenactor for a Higginson. So consider that.
I'd be like the old guy in the regiment. I think I'm kind of past my sort of military service, but
well, some reenactors are a little bit older than the people they portray. I'm amazed at how young he was, 17 years old. And that one shot there with the side part he was just 23, but he was the youngest student at Harvard.
Yeah.
13 years old.
Yeah, he literally is. I mean, people went to Harvard younger in those days, but he was 16. I mean, he was literally the youngest guy in his entering class. And of course, in those days, they really test you to get in. There's several days of really grilling, you by the senior faculty, and passed with flying colors. So no, he obviously was a very, very, very smart guy. I mean, just he wrote about 100 articles. I tried to count 100 articles in the Atlantic over the course of his career. Some have been republished. Of course, the Atlantic's also online. And again, some are just walk in the woods, but others are about being with the soldiers in South Carolina. Well, I'm getting here from Rich. Please expand on he held his nose and voted for Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, at that point in his career was not an abolitionist, and Lincoln, of course, never embraced the term abolitionist, although I certainly would argue by the end of the war, when he was advocating voting rights for Black soldiers, he absolutely was an abolitionist. But there was a Liberty Party candidate, Gerrit Smith, in running in 1860, and so for a lot of really hardcore abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, Lincoln was just too moderate, and nothing. Of course, the 1860 platform said slavery must end tomorrow in Alabama anytime soon. It simply was a free soil platform. So actually, Higginson got in a fight with many of his allies at a big convention, and he said, "Look, if we don't vote for this guy, he's the first legitimately anti-slavery candidate running ever, really, or at least since John Quincy Adams. And if we don't vote for him, we're going to get Stephen Douglas or John C. Breckinridge or John Bell. They're all going to be way much worse." And at one of these meetings, one of Higginson's allies got up and he said, "I love my friend Higginson. I just hate his opinions." So for Higginson to vote for Lincoln, that kind of put him outside of where a lot of abolitionists were. Douglas went ahead and voted for Gerrit Smith. And of course, we all understand how the Electoral College functions. If enough people had voted third party for Gerrit Smith, possibly Lincoln would not have won. Now, again, we know he won handily, but they didn't know that at the time. So that's what I meant by that. He was a grudging Lincoln voter in 60, and by the way, a happy Lincoln voter in 64. So that kind of helps answer that question.
Well, very good. I see Dan Gray, you had some questions there. Dan, if you want to open your mic, if you have any follow-up questions about that. He indeed was a member of the Secret Six and the only one who didn't leave when it looked as though they would get arrested. But Dan, if you want to open your mic and ask any follow-up questions.
I just want to make sure, Kurt, my mic is working. Does it sound okay?
Yes, it does.
Okay. I read Army Life in the Regiment, and what was really fascinating about Higginson was how he listened to the spirituals his soldiers were singing when they were marching along the Shell Road. And I don't understand why he joined this foolish mugwump move or, joining the Democratic Party. I think it was the Cincinnati Convention. I can understand why Charles Adams did it. The Adams brothers had this real hang up about hardcore Republicans, but with what the Southern states were doing through the black codes and the voting laws, it did make sense for Higginson to go that route.
I agree completely, and I don't really have a good answer for that. I mean, he's right. James G. Blaine was famously corrupt, and for the Republicans to nominate him was a really bad move. But no, he gave a famous speech in South Carolina. And it was kind of the classic both sides. Well, right, things aren't great down here in South Carolina. But we still have segregated streetcars in Boston. Well, yes, yeah, that's not a good thing, but it's not the same thing as having your church burned down, in South Carolina. And his former corporal, Prince Rivers, had become a judge, and they actually set fire to his house. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't absolve the North from racism, but what's going on down there was dreadful. And what caused him for a while friendship with Lucy Stone is that he endorsed Grover Cleveland for the presidency. Even after the story came out about him being, father, of an unwed mother, and of course in those days that was a huge deal. And that cost a lot. I mean, that's basically why he was asked to lead the co-editorship of the Woman's Journal. Because a lot of women thought he just kind of sold them out by endorsing this guy they regarded, Cleveland, is a really bad sexual predator, which, by the way, he was. I mean, we have more data on that story now.
There's that book in New York talked about how Cleveland not only raped the woman, but took the child away from the widow and used power. And the guy became the leading obstetrician in the city of Buffalo in the early 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, at the time it raised eyebrows. I mean, certainly, of course, now, bear in mind, at that point, only guys were voting. And so it wasn't kind of the scandal it would be, 1960. But no, Higginson met Cleveland and said, well, he's a decent guy, and this happened years ago. And Lucy Stone said, that's not an excuse. He was an adult. He wasn't 12. And you're exactly right. I mean, they didn't know now. They didn't know then what we know now about. It basically was what we would today call date rape. It was not consensual at all. I can't explain that. It's not a good moment in his career. And yeah, he's not alone. The son of Garrison becomes a Democrat, but it's the fact that he just kind of ignores what's happening in the South, and just the daily attacks on Black schools and churches, the lynching that's going on. One of my books, 4 or 5 books back, is called The Wars of Reconstruction. And Robert Smalls, who actually you all know who Smalls was, he was the famous South Carolina pilot from Beaufort who stole the planter, turned it over to the U.S. Navy, and went into politics. In the 1890s, he gives a speech. He says 53,000 Black activists had been systematically killed. Doesn't say 50, doesn't say about 50, says 53,000. Smalls is keeping numbers. He's keeping data. That's Gettysburg-like casualties. And Higginson, doesn't pay attention to that. And I wish I had a better answer for why that was the case.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks, Dan. And I see David Kent and Bill Dickinson have some similar questions. But before we get there, I wanted to give Bernie Sadler a chance because he played a reenactor in Glory. And do you have any thoughts or comments, Bernie, about this? Or if you don't right now, if you want to think about it and chime in. Go ahead.
I do. And Doug, thanks a lot. Great presentation. I want to say that Life in a Black Regiment was the one book that I took under my wings when I first became a reenactor. And when we did Glory, they used reenactors as extras portraying the 54th Massachusetts, but they used non-reenactors portraying the 1st and 2nd South Carolina, which were former slaves. And it was a microcosm of the reality because most of our reenactors, we were, professional guys who were college educated, scholars, writers, authors, and the extras on the set were very similar to the 1st and 2nd South Carolina as they would have been back then.
Yeah.
And so we had that kind of cultural diversity. But my other question, though, was this. When the fall of 1862, when the first Kansas colored, the 1st South Carolina, 2nd South Carolina, and the Native Guard down in New Orleans, they were all formed at a time before the War Department actually authorized the use of Black troops. Yeah. Lincoln had done the emancipation. It was to be effective January 1st. So was Higginson's regiment part of that renegade, for lack of a better term, regiment, or was he sanctioned by the War Department by that point?
Great question, and the answer is from yes and no. So when it's first David Hunter who raises what was called the First South Carolina Regiment, and does a terrible job at it, and he simply tries to kind of corral Black guys into serving. He just basically rounds them up and says, you'll be serving, no questions asked. What gets him, of course, fired by Lincoln is then announces he's freeing all the slaves in the Department of the South, way ahead of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had the odd idea that he should be in charge of that and not some general in the field. So when Hunter's first raising Black guys on the Carolina coast, it's under the radar. By the time Higginson gets there at the invitation of Saxton, it's been approved by the War Department. So technically, the First South Carolina is the first Black regiment to be approved by Washington, D.C. And you're right, out there in Kansas, James Lane, summer of '62, writes to the War Department and says, well, I'm raising a regiment of runaway slaves, and we got some Native Americans here. And Edwin Stanton writes back and says, don't ask, don't tell. Like, I don't want to know what's going on out there, that kind of thing. So, of course, the 54th is famous as the first Northern regiment raised. So the first actually is the first authorized by the War Department in early December of '62. So they have kind of pride of place, but all three are kind of forming at the time. And some of the guys who were there with David Hunter are still there when Higginson gets to the coast. So there's some continuity there, but Hunter was had no idea what he was doing. And Higginson realizes really early on, he's got all these great Black non-commissioned officers. And I talk about this a bit in the book. When people run away from plantations, there's a plantation hierarchy. If you're a black driver is kind of a sub-overseer under the white overseer. Then if you're a plantation artisan, which you're probably also literate, you're kind of at the top of the slave hierarchy. So when these guys get to Beaufort and enlist, the guys who were the coach drivers, that was Prince Rivers, the guys who were kind of the authority figures on the plantation, they're the ones who probably become the sergeants and the corporals. And Higginson is fine with that. He's got to let these guys, manage all these Black privates. I'll deal with Washington. I'll get the ships to go upriver, that kind of thing. But he lets them run the show, and he has no, he talks to them. He walks around at night, listening to their prayers. And as you mentioned, very carefully writes them down, even using dialect in his book. But never tries to pretend that he understands them or vice versa. So really leaves it to guys like Prince Rivers and Robert Sutton to do kind of the heavy lifting. And again, these guys, most of these guys knew each other in slavery. So they just kind of fall back into their old roles of you're the alpha male and I'm the B guy, that kind of thing. And Higginson gets that implicitly.
Good. One more follow-up. Now, in Glory, there was a scene that showed the sacking and burning of Darien, Georgia. Yeah. And my question is, was Higginson ever under Colonel Montgomery, who authorized that raid, which was done reluctantly by Colonel Shaw? It felt like a war crime, which we know now it was. Was Higginson involved in that?
He was not involved with that, but they're both in. At one point, First South Carolina is in charge of retaking Jacksonville, Florida. The U.S. had taken Jacksonville, then let it go back to the Confederates, and so the plan is to bring it back and use Jacksonville as the kind of nucleus to bring Florida back into the Union by '64 elections and get those electoral votes. So Higginson's not involved in burning Darien. And by the way, I've got some issues with Glory, and that's not one of them. The sacking of Darien happened just the way it did in the movie. But they're together in Florida, and Higginson thinks that he's a little bit eccentric, Montgomery, but otherwise a really good soldier. Whereas Shaw thinks he's just, psychotic and a war criminal. So what you see in Glory, Shaw's view of Montgomery is accurate and spot on. So Higginson, I'm not sure Higginson really knew that much about the burning of Darien, but he thought Montgomery was a good guy to march with. They go marching out of the outskirts of Jacksonville, rounding up slaves and attacking Confederate pickets, that kind of thing. Right. So the two of them get along fine, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. My only beef with the movie, and I love doing the movie, was if they bothered to use Frederick Douglass in one of the scenes up in Boston. He met with Shaw and all that. Why not have Lewis Douglass be the sergeant major as opposed to some made-up character named Rollins?
I agree 100%.
Same with Denzel Washington carrying the flag. It should have been William Carney who won the Medal of Honor. So I'm just saying little things like that. But otherwise, I enjoyed.
Well, I mean, it's amazing that you were involved in that. And like I said, it's, you know, the acting is just so superb. And you know, like probably all of you, I own the DVD and I watch it every July 18 and you know, tear up. But yeah, I mean, it gets big and small things wrong. And I understand the movie is not a documentary, but I wish of the six main characters, the two white guys and the four black guys, Shaw's the only real person. The rest are kind of composites and that kind of thing. Peter Mogelsang, who's the old guy in the regiment, I mean, that'd be Morgan Freeman. And why Lewis Douglass, who was a sergeant major and was badly wounded at Wagner, but lived. That would be a great addition to the movie. And the character play what's the white actor who plays the major, Cary Elwes.
Elwes,
I mean, the real life, second in command was Ned Hallowell, you know, shot at Wagner but survived and took over the regiment after Rob Shaw. Right. So I wish they'd gotten a few more things like that right. And in fact, the actor who played Douglas was so old he died right after the movie was filmed.
Raymond St. Jacques, I think his name was.
Okay. He looked like a great older Douglas. I mean, Douglas was 44 in 1862. He was still a pretty vital guy. So like I said, I loved it, but I wish, and it's a great story that you read it. I mean, that's just amazing. I wish I could say the same thing, but yeah, I wish it had gotten a few more things right.
For everybody's edification, if you watch the movie, the DVD, or whatever, if you see,
absolutely,
you see the fighting on top of the hill. If you see a Union soldier whose hat falls off fighting a Confederate one-on-one, that's me. And if you see,
next time I watch it, I'll look for that. Thanks, that's great.
If you see them charging through the moat, and you see somebody fall on the water, and you see a soldier reach down and pull them out, that's me too. That's my
fantastic.
Bernie, I'd like you to get in touch with me if you could at admin@CWRTDC.org as a follow-up, because we've had other professors talk about problems with movies. Professor Daoud Watts down at, I forget where he was, but he talked about one of the other movies and the problems, and he does rate movies about their authenticity. But it's a great thing if I can impose upon you to write something up, because that's a great way to get new people interested in the actual history when they can hear about what's right and what's wrong in movies. I'd love for you to contact me so we could follow up on that, because that would be great.
My pleasure. And I've been in a couple of other movies too that I can do the same critique. So I'd love to do that.
That would be wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see, David Kent and Bill Dickinson. Maybe we'll start with David. If you are still on, if you have any questions that you wanted to follow up with Doug about John Brown and Bill Dickinson, if you want to follow up.
Yeah, I think that there's some overlap between what Bill and I and Dan Gray were asking, but basically just go into more about his relationship with John Brown. I mean, did he meet him? Did he know him? Why would he give all the money and support him the way that he did? I got a hint of it from the Man on Fire. I mean, is somebody who didn't do things halfway.
No, they met a number of occasions, and the first time he's back in Worcester and gets a telegram saying, you got to come into Boston and meet this guy. He's the real thing, and he's going to take the fight the Confederates, and Higginson had great admiration for Brown. But he always claimed that Brown had been reading about Maroons in the Caribbean. Maroons, of course, were the runaways who could start these like Freetown in Jamaica, that kind of thing. And as far as Higginson knew, Brown's plan was to invade into the hills of Western Virginia, free some slaves, create kind of a maroon colony up in the hills, use that as a base then to come down and free more slaves and kind of sort of weaken slavery in Virginia on the kind of western side. Brown would vanish then for 10 months. He just kind of disappear, and nobody would hear from him. So when Higginson heard about Harper's Ferry, he claimed it was the first time he'd ever heard about attacking a federal arsenal, trying to free slaves that way. And Higginson said later in life, I wish I sat him down and said, John, you're a great guy, but you really are in over your head. You have no idea what you're doing. And assuming Higginson was telling the truth, and he writes his memoirs late in life, so there's no reason he's not going to be prosecuted. There's no reason that he would lie. He was all behind the idea of this kind of maroon colony base up in the Western Virginia hills. I think he would not have had a problem necessarily with Brown attacking a federal arsenal, because Higginson believed in disunion. That was one of his hobbies. It was breaking the country up. So I think committing treason was not an issue that Higginson had a problem with. It was just the logistics that it was just not really feasible. And so when Brown is arrested, and word reaches Higginson that the Brown family up in the way of the hills, up on this land given to them by Gerrit Smith, up near Lake Placid, are starving. Higginson gets on the train, gets a wagon and his horse, and rides up there, and brings them money and food, and then takes Brown's wife, and they get on the train, and they're going to go to Western Virginia, and kind of plead for Brown's life, which is really amazing. Higginson is complicit in this, and he's actually going to go into the lion's den. And Brown writes this amazing letter to Higginson and says, don't bring her here. Right now I'm resolute. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to die. But if you bring her here, I will falter, and I don't want to falter. And so take her back home. So Higginson does take her back home. And as Kurt mentioned a few moments ago, everybody scatters. Douglas rather wisely heads across the border into Canada. Then gets on a boat for London. They're really after him, of course. Gerrit Smith checks into an insane asylum. Other Secret Six run for Canada. And Higginson just waits in Worcester to be arrested. And he writes to one Secret Six and says, is there no honor among thieves? We went into this with our eyes wide open. We knew that whatever he was going to do, Brown would be breaking the law. And now we're trying to pretend we were part of it. And so Higginson just kind of placidly waits to be arrested. And they don't come for him, I think in part because of the way, poor Button was treated back in 1954 when he came to Worcester to arrest Higginson. Higginson, he had no problem with breaking the law. I think it was just he thought that Brown had no idea what he was doing. And in hindsight, I think we got to all agree that Brown was in way over his head.
Thank you. Bill Dickinson, do you have any follow-up questions? He may have dropped off, or if your mic is closed. Of course, Higginson had a little bit of protection being a minister and being white. Those things helped.
Actually, one of my favorite stories.
Yeah, it's almost like it's almost like
actually the first time he meets Brown, he's out in Kansas running guns for the New England Immigrant Societies. He's raising money. And then so you got to bring us the guns. So he's out there, and he's just riding around. And of course, at this point, he's got this giant sombrero on, and he's got his Sharps rifle, and he's got his Bowie knife stuck in his boot. And he rides into a pro-slavery town in Kansas territory. And he's talking to these two ruffians, and they said, well, there's this radical minister out here, and he's ministering to the Negroes, and doesn't use the word Negro. And we're going to find him, and we're going to kill him. And Higginson says, well, I'll keep my eyes peeled, and if I see anybody who looks like that, I'll let you know. And of course, what they're looking for is the classic stereotype New England minister, and here's the 6'2" guy with a rifle and a Bowie knife. but again, he was never afraid of that kind of danger. And writes to his mother and says, don't worry about me. But he's all over Kansas by himself. But I love that story. I'll keep my eyes peeled for that minister. I'll let you know if I see him. So again, just a fun guy to write about.
Doug, Bill Dickinson here. Question. I've been doing some research on a couple. They were abolitionists out of New York City, Marcus and Rebecca Spring.
Oh, yeah.
And she writes a lot about Higginson and her papers. And I was wondering if you run into her at all. She did go visit John Brown several times. And I think she even took Mrs. Brown back up to New Jersey to give her sort of a safe haven. And so anyhow, that's one question. And the other was, she also alluded in her papers that Higginson was thinking about running a rescue operation of John Brown, which John Brown put the kibosh on. True or not?
Well, not Brown, but the rest of Brown's men. But bear in mind, it takes them months to trial these guys, and so Brown dies pretty early on. He's one of the first to be hanged. And a lot of these other guys are still just kind of cooling their heels in this not very well defended jail in Western Virginia. And so Higginson's approached. And Montgomery is involved in this lunacy. That they're going to take a handful of guys and go down and break these guys out of jail and try to get them up into Ohio or Pennsylvania. And Higginson does all the pros and cons in this kind of very long letter to himself. It's in the winter. It's there's bad terrain. Again, this is the hill country in Western Virginia. If you've been to the Charlestown area, and he said there'll be a gunfight getting them out, and then we'll have to get these guys and possibly wounded guys out through the snow. And he finally just says that this is just simply not doable. But he actually is considering the possibility of leading guys again, including Montgomery, down to try to free Brown's guys, and it does correspond with the guys. And again, he's a former minister, so he's all they know they're going to die, and he's writing them letters about the next world and next life and that kind of thing. But no, he's briefly involved with that, and he realizes correctly it's just an insane idea that has like zero chance of working out.
Right. Did you run into the Springs at all?
I think they have a couple of cameos in the book, and bear in mind this is a fairly kind of small community of sort of Venn diagram of abolitionists and women's rights guys. So they're all these endless conference, up and down the Erie Canal, all through Massachusetts. So they all know each other pretty well. So I think they have like one or two paragraphs only in the book, but these people are kind of in contact with one another all the time and corresponding all the time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Doug, we had one comment from Sue Eikenberry, but I think she left. But it is true, and we've seen this many times where for a participant in the war, where it wasn't about themselves. They weren't there for their own self-promotion. A lot of times there's nothing written on them. And for him, it was about his mission and about what he wanted to do. And yes, he made that comment about, if there's a biographer later, maybe they'll be able to use these materials. But certainly it was about his mission and not about self-promotion. And of course, he had PTSD, I guess, after the war. So it wasn't something that he necessarily wanted to write a self-promoting book. And so thank you very much for doing that for him. There was that 2008 biography, but it was more narrowly focused. So you actually have brought him to light in the full sense since the biographies back in '67. And thank you very much, because he is someone that we should consider as a model today. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation.
Great to be here and great to talk to you all, and great questions and many thanks.
Well, thank you all. And again, if we didn't have everybody on mute, you'd hear a lot of clapping. Thank you all for joining us.
We're 10